What I like about glass is its transparency. It's got qualities that other materials don't have. So you can work with the outer form of it, but you've also got an inner space, which gives you another whole dimension. I think that casting is just an incredibly powerful technique. It gives the possibility to incorporate found objects, found forms and textures into a completely new piece. I've found inspiration in nature since really quite early on. It's so rich in form and texture, which are very often my starting points. I'm a lifelong sailor. I really love it. And I've been sailing on the west coast of Scotland in the last few years. Being on a small boat gives you access to quite inaccessible places that you couldn't easily reach in other ways. And so I've found myself often in incredibly beautiful places looking at this, just the wonderful richness of rock. In a way, it's so abundant that we don't really notice it. We sort of see the beautiful landscape, but when you actually look closely at the rocks, they are absolutely incredible. And so I've been using that opportunity to make casts that I can then take back to the studio and then develop work from them. Any piece of rock isn't necessarily going to work. I'm looking for particular qualities that kind of appeal to me. This is volcanic rock, basalt, so it's fractured and it's got fissures in it. So that's something that can make a very dynamic form when you isolate it. I'll select the area that I want to work, and then I start mixing up my silicone putty. It's quite a sort of concentrated process because once I start, I can't stop. If I wait for too long, it started to cure and then the next batch doesn't stick to it. So I sort of have to be very prepared, start work and then work consistently until I've covered the whole area that I want to make a cast of. The materials I'm using are completely clean. They leave no trace on the rock, so I'm not sort of leaving anything, and I'm not taking anything other than an impression of the texture. It's a completely non-invasive process. Then you wait for 10-15 minutes and start to peel it carefully away. You sort of work your way along and it gradually, the whole thing releases and you're left with a faithful reproduction of the form and the texture of that area of rock. So that's then my starting point for making this piece. Once I get that mould back into the studio, the first step is actually to make another silicone mould, but using a more traditional kind of silicone. The silicone putty is extremely convenient for working in the field, but it's not a long-lasting material. So I need a permanent and accurate cast of that. So that's step number one. Once I've got that, I can start to paint wax on. So I melt wax and with a paintbrush, literally paint it on. I don't need it to be too thick, just so it supports itself, but it gives me a really precise impression of the form and the texture that I was attracted to in the first place. So I'll take that piece of wax and I'll start to cut it up, melt it, and gradually build it up into the form of the sculpture. The wax is only really needed for the texture. If I need to have bulk, I'll use polystyrene, for example, because it's just better for flat surfaces and for creating the bulk of the piece. I like working with my hands, I like to make things, and I stumbled across glass really by chance. Many years ago I was in Brixton Labour Exchange and there was a sign on the wall that had a list of government training courses, things like carpentry and plumbing. And at the bottom it said scientific glass blowing. I was just intrigued, and so I found myself starting a 6-month full-time course in making lab equipment. And I did it with the idea that if I could learn this, maybe I could use it for doing something more creative of my own. And basically that's what I did. I don't draw the piece that I'm going to make and then make it. I sort of feel my way into it, looking at it, sort of standing back and sort of changing it and just getting the form to kind of feel right and to have the right balance and the right movement and so on, sort of coaxing the thing into life. I'll eventually end up with the finished form, which is what I want to see in glass. Once I've finished making the model, Karen Browning, my assistant, takes that and we'll make the refractory mould from it. What we're doing is to build a box around it essentially and seal all the gaps with clay and then mix up mould material, so it's a combination of plaster of Paris and silica. And then carefully pour it into the mould so that the material is rising up around the form, not sort of trapping air bubbles. And then leave it for sort of half an hour until the mould mix has completely gone off. The wax can then be steamed out. You wrap the whole thing up in polythene, put steam into it, and gradually over a period of a few hours the wax melts. The polystyrene can just be carefully pulled out. Everything comes out of the mould. That then needs to be cleaned up, and there's always a bit of refinement to do at that stage. But eventually I've got the finished mould which is ready to go in the kiln. What I need to know is how much glass I need to fill the mould. So the way that I do that is by pouring water into it and measuring how much water it takes to fill the mould up to the point where I want the glass to get to. So I can measure the correct amount of glass and prepare it to go into the mould. Kiln-casting is one of the oldest methods of forming glass, probably goes back 4,000 odd years. Long before blowing was invented by the Romans, glass was melted and cast into moulds, and basically that's the same technique that I'm using now. The mould goes into the kiln. The whole thing is fired up, so the kiln will probably take a couple of days to go up to temperature. It could go up much faster, but because I'm dealing with big blocks of glass, I have to take it up slowly and carefully so I don't crack the glass. Then it's melted at about 80 degrees centigrade. The actual casting is fairly quick. It only takes a couple of hours for the glass to completely fill the mould and take the impression of all of the texture and the form. But then it takes 2-3 weeks, depending on the size of the piece, to cool it back down to room temperature. That's a controlled cooling, and it's in order to relieve any stress in the glass. If you take it down too quickly in temperature, it builds up stress, which is permanent, and it will either crack in the kiln or it could crack at any point afterwards. It's not a good idea to be in a hurry with this process. You do need a certain amount of patience to make things like this. But eventually it gets down to room temperature, and then I'll open the kiln. With the refractory moulds like that, you have to break the mould away in order to get the glass out, so it's a one-off mould. Although you do an awful lot to set everything up based on a lot of past experience, when the glass melts, you don't really have full control over it at that stage. There's an element of chance in this process, which I like because it kind of leaves the window open to other possibilities. The thing that I've really got that I want will be the texture that's taken from the original rock and the basic form of the other parts of the piece. But it's the start of a long process of cold working. I've adapted an engineering Bridgeport milling machine for work with glass, so I can put the glass on and cut the surface back gradually. I might take several millimetres, 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes a centimetre off the entire surface to get back to nice clean glass, and to basically get all of the surfaces true and as I want them. As well as milling the flat surfaces, I'm also using a variety of handheld tools. They're mostly not really specialist glass equipment at all, but some of them are borrowed from the stone industry, or I also use automotive air tools, but fitted with diamond burrs, diamond blades, and a water feed. All these processes are done wet. It's both to cool the cutting, because you don't want the glass heating up and cracking. It also washes away the dust, because you don't want clouds of dust rising off it either. And I can carve it, cut it, saw it, really make some quite major interventions in it. So it's working in a very sculptural way with it at that point. I've got the basic shape at this point, but the surface needs to be refined more. So then I've got the flatbed grinder, so it's basically a big cast iron flat wheel with slurry, and it's grinding those surfaces back so that they're completely clean, flat, true. When it gets onto the finer grinding and polishing stages, it's on a machine called a rociprolap, which is a sort of vibratory polisher, and you do leave it like all day after day, and it gets it to an incredibly both flat but a beautiful silky kind of surface, which is actually ready to polish from. And then the machine's washed down and the piece goes back onto it with a polishing pad and polishing compound. Once I've done all of that, there'll quite often be work on the detail of the texture as well, with small handheld grinders to just sort of, carve it and get everything as I want it. The polished surface is then more or less finished, but everything else during all of these steps has become pretty filthy and encrusted looking. So the next step is to mask up all of the polished areas and carefully trim back the masking, then sandblast all of the other areas to get that completely clean. And then for the first time, actually, you really see what the finished piece is going to look like. It's a really lovely moment. What I like about this particular piece is there's a kind of dynamic movement to it. As the light passes through it, you see an almost uninterrupted image of what's at the other side of it. But if you have the polished surfaces at a certain angle to each other, they act almost as a mirror. You get total internal refraction. It's almost as if you're seeing something inside the glass that's not there, and as you move around it, that changes and you get quite a strong kinetic quality.